In today's episode of NUFC Transfer Daily, another Premier League winger is linked, there's an update on a long-term striker target, and a big-name centre-back has been offered to Newcastle. Let's get into it. Hello and welcome back to my YouTube channel. Thanks so much for joining me once again. If you haven't already, please do subscribe and hit like on this video because it really does help. The channel is growing, these videos are doing really well. I'm really pleased with the progress of Transfer Daily, so thanks so much for joining me. 3 fresh rumours, 3 fresh situations to discuss. Obviously yesterday's video was filmed just before talks with James Trafford were confirmed by Sky Sports News. I don't think we really have to go too much into those today because we've discussed Trafford at length in the very first episode of NUFC Transfer Daily, and we said that on that video that Burnley were looking for around £30 million and Newcastle are probably going to stump that up. I think this one has got legs, this one will likely happen. But if you want to understand why Newcastle are chasing James Trafford, then I think we'll either talk about him in detail once he's signed, or you can just go back and refer back to that very first video. At the moment, I don't think there's really much more that needs to be said about James Trafford until these talks progress, but we know that the interest is long term. We know that this has been going on a while. Last year they had bids of around £15 to £20 million rejected. If Burnley want £30 million off the back of that season that he's had, then it looks like this one could move. And whether he'll replace Nick Pope, or they'll battle for number 1, or they'll share the cups and the league games, all of that we'll probably discuss once he's signed, if that does happen. But today we're going to talk about a Premier League winger to start off with, and that winger is Mohammed Kudus. So Newcastle have obviously made inquiries for Anthony Elanga and João Pedro as potential forward improvements this summer. And another name on that list has been confirmed by Chris Waugh from The Athletic, a friend of the channel, as Mohammed Kudus, which is not a surprise at all, because they were interested in Newcastle before he went to West Ham for £45 million a couple of years ago. He's now sort of Premier League experience and all that sort of debate that we're not going to touch on again today. Had a difficult season last year, but his quality is evident. He turns 25, I think, in August, so coming into his peak. A little bit older than what Newcastle would ideally like to sign these players for. Obviously, João Pedro and Anthony Elanga are both 23, and that's, as we've sort of discussed, the age that Newcastle are looking to try and sign players between 21 and 23, ideally. But that isn't a hard and fast rule, and if the right player comes along, then this might fit. He's had a difficult season, only 8 goals and assists in the Premier League last year, but obviously West Ham had a really, really poor season. They need to sell as well, by the sounds of it. The club have been honest about that, and so West Ham are open to a deal, I think, for pretty much anybody bar maybe Jared Bowen. So this is a deal that Newcastle could do. I was really impressed in spurts at West Ham, I think. Scored a couple of goals against Newcastle in his first season, both home and away. The thing I noticed last season, even though it was a really poor West Ham team, when Newcastle beat them at London Stadium just before the cup final, him and Jared Bowen really made a difference. The team was shell-shocked. It didn't really know what it was doing on the ball until those 2 players got it, and then suddenly they looked like they were a threat. And I think that's the sort of player that Newcastle could use. Statistically, as you'll see here, only really impressive in terms of take-ons from last season. As I say, it wasn't his best year. 97th percentile in that. That is, again, sort of mouldable, something that Eddie Howe can work with, I'm absolutely sure. And I think if the price was right here, especially when you consider the valuations that Forest and Brighton are likely to put on João Pedro and Anthony Elanga. Obviously, we don't actually know officially what those are, but there hasn't been any progress on those inquiries, and I think that the noises coming out from both clubs are very, very stern, sort of warning off of those players. So this is a deal that could be done a lot more easily, I think. That doesn't necessarily mean it's the right deal to do, but if Newcastle could maybe offer 35 to 40 as an opening gambit, then maybe see where West Ham are. Perhaps it would work. 14 goals and assists in his first season, which was when he was really impressive, and the team was much better under David Moyes. As I say, he's got the sort of raw attributes that Eddie Howe likes. He's direct, he gets shots off and gets goals and gets assists, not obviously off the back of last season, but he can also play, he's also left-footed, which would allow him to be inverted on that side. He can play in the number 10 role as well, set more centrally. So there are a lot of pros to this, and maybe the fact that he's had a bad season, maybe that is the time to sort of strike at a lower rate and maybe take that risk and see if Eddie Howe can get him back to where his best football was. He obviously scored 11 goals for Ajax the season before he left, which was a really, really impressive return, and he really did shine there. And as I say, Newcastle held a real interest, but West Ham got there first. You think that Kudus is a really impressive player. When you look at the stats, you can absolutely see why, although Kudus has been on the list, they've moved for Pedro and they've moved for Elanga over him. There's a slight difference in terms of the Premier League premium and the money that you have to pay for these players because West Ham need to sell. And in that case, you could maybe test the resolve of West Ham and see what you could get out of this deal. I think he would be a good signing. As I say, again, it depends on the price. The common theme I'm trying to put across when it comes to these Premier League players is they're good players. They really do improve Newcastle. It's just the price that matters. And I think if there's the reason why I maybe appear more open on Kudus than the other two is not necessarily because Kudus is a better player, but because the price is more reflective of what a deal that Newcastle could do while also not harming their ability to strengthen more across the board. And he would be an upgrade on that right-hand side. I really do believe that. There's been reports over the last couple of days that Newcastle have moved on to him. Not sure that's the case, but he's definitely being discussed by the recruitment team. He's definitely one of those players alongside Antoine Semenyo as well, who we haven't discussed because they haven't really there hasn't been a reason really to. And I think, Tottenham have been linked with him, and Bournemouth are in the same sort of situation where they don't need to sell, so the price would be this talk of £70 million, which is just really, really crazy money. It's just not doable for Newcastle. So Kudus is the one difference and the one possibility, and that's of that cluster of players who could join for a low price. So maybe that is the one to watch. Let me know in the comment section what you think on Mohammed Kudus as well. The next player we're going to discuss is a long-term target and someone who I've long admired. As you know, last year we had Steve Caldwell on talking about Jonathan David, and there's a little bit of an update. I've spoken to a couple of people in Canada about the situation just to sort of see where he's at. Obviously Newcastle have had him on their list for a long time, and they've held initial discussions by the sounds of it. I think his agent was at a match last season as well. So the interest has been lodged, and Newcastle have joined that queue, but the fact that the queue is growing means that it's unlikely that he'll join. He was set to join Napoli by the sounds of it, and Juventus have been heavily linked. Italy was the most likely place and destination for him, but apparently his wage demands have been so high that it's basically reopened it, and nobody really knows where he's going. There is no clear path for Jonathan David at this point. Does that allow Newcastle back into the race? I'm not quite sure, because the wage demands are the issue, and Newcastle have a soft salary cap, and there's a feeling inside the club that they don't want to break that salary cap for any incoming players. They want to break it, if they're going to sign Alexander Isak to a new contract. So I feel like this is even less likely to happen from a Newcastle perspective. But it is interesting to know where Jonathan David will go now, because the wage demands being that what they are, Serie A is lacking in funds and lacking in sort of cachet, if you like, at the moment because of a lot of issues. So where Jonathan David goes will be very, very interesting. Will he join Newcastle? I still don't think so. I think they missed their chance if they should have signed him last summer when I was really pushing for it, when they could have gone to Lille, got a march on all the other clubs, bid sort of 20-25 million and got the deal done at that point. That was what Steve Caldwell was telling us that was possible, and that's when Newcastle should have acted. January, a couple of clubs did. Lille were at the point where they wanted to secure Champions League football, so they weren't listening to any offers. And then suddenly, by the time he's free, there's all these clubs registered their interest, that it's very, very difficult for Newcastle to stick out from the crowd, especially when you've got the issue of him not being the very first choice and his wage demands being exceedingly high by the sounds of it. So very, very interesting to know where Jonathan David will go, but it doesn't look like he's going to be joining Newcastle, unfortunately. And finally, the other thing to talk about is Fikayo Tomori from AC Milan, 27-year-old England defender, 5 caps for his country, which is a criminally low number in my opinion. I think he's a very, very good defender, reportedly offered to Newcastle. Again, financial issues in Serie A are meaning that these clubs are looking to sell high value assets and the prices apparently come down for Tomori. Milan reportedly valued him at £40+ million last summer. That's no longer the case. But this is a deal that I think if Newcastle really wanted Tomori, then they would have made a play for him earlier. This is a deal that's really been on the cards in terms of his exit for a while. He rejected Spurs in January. This is very, very unlikely. He's 27 as well, which is by no means old, but it's older than Newcastle are looking to do signings. We've said ideally 21 to 23, possibly up to 25 is really the sort of where they're looking to do deals. So Tomori is very, very unlikely at this stage. Exceedingly good defender though. I think 2 years ago he was my preferred choice. I remember watching him in both the Champions League games against Milan. In the San Siro, he was absolutely fantastic alongside Malik Thiaw. At St James's Park, he obviously made that ridiculous goal line clearance against Miguel Almiron, which would have maybe turned that game and seen Newcastle progress in the Champions League. So Tomori's definitely liked within the club, a possibility on paper, but I think, as I say, it's unlikely that this one will happen because he's quietly been available for some time. I think Milan have been open to the sale of him for a while. He, by the sounds of it, is more open to leaving now than he was. He's been very vocal about his commitment to Milan, so whether he moves this summer is looking more likely, but I doubt it'll be to Newcastle. Mark Gahey is still the top target. We know that at centre-half. For me, Crystal Palace going for Ousmane Diomande. He fits the bill perfectly. Tomori, as much as he's a very, very good defender, also only played 22 games last season, 26 the season before. Very, very injury-prone over the last couple of years, which is a big, big shame. So I don't see this one happening. Thanks so much for joining me on this latest episode of NUFC Transfer Daily. As always, please like, share and subscribe. Get involved if you haven't already. I'll be back tomorrow with another one. And yeah, I'll see you then. Cheers.